Hi, my name is David Hicks. Welcome to a new video series I'm doing. This one is on the Sermon on the Mount, a collection of Jesus' teachings that we read in Matthew chapters 5 through 7. Now, as you'll see here, there's a little, you might think it's a subtitle, but it's not exactly that. Where I put here also, Sermon on the Plain. And the reason that it's not technically a subtitle is because it's another set of Jesus' teachings found in the Gospel of Luke that is very similar to the teachings that are in the Sermon on the Mount. And from everything we can tell, these are actually two different times in which Jesus taught his disciples, in which Jesus taught his people. And although a lot of the teachings are very similar, these are not actually the exact same sermons. They could be, and we'll look at that. But it is important to keep in mind that Jesus went from place to place, town to town. He went on a circuit. He traveled around teaching God's word. And he would have repeated his teachings several times in several places, not using the exact same words every time, but most certainly teaching the exact same principles, the exact same commandments, the exact same things that he wanted people to do wherever he went. But he would use similar illustrations, the same illustrations, as he went from place to place. So it's not surprising then that we could get two very similar sermons in the writings about Christ's life. And so we're going to look mainly in this series on the Sermon on the Mount. That is in Matthew chapter 5 through 7. But whenever there's some overlap there with what's called the Sermon on the Plain, and we'll talk about why they're both called that in just a minute here, then we'll look at both and we'll compare them side by side because they'll help us understand each other. They'll enhance each other's the teachings in each place. So let's jump into it. To get to the background to the Sermon on the Mount, let's read Matthew chapter 4, beginning at verse 23, going to verse 25. Jesus went throughout Galilee. Now, Galilee was the northern section of Israel. Israel at this time was very oddly divided, and this is the area that comprises the eastern border of the Mediterranean Sea. The northern part was Galilee. The middle part was Samaria, which wasn't actually Israel. They were their own race, their own people. But the lower half was Judea. So you had Judea, Jewish, part of Israel, Samaria, not part of Israel, and then Galilee, again, a Jewish area that was part of the nation of Israel. So Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogues. Synagogues were, you might say, the church buildings of even today, you could think of as a Jewish, is the places of worship. Okay, they met there for worship. They met there to learn God's teachings. Those were the primary reasons for the synagogues. They had other uses as well, but the synagogues were extremely important part of everyday life at this point in Jewish history. So Jesus was going, as I said, on this circuit. He went throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness among the people. News about him spread all over Syria, and people brought to him all who were ill with various diseases, those suffering severe pain, the demon-possessed, the epileptics, and the paralytics, and he healed them. Large crowds from Galilee, the Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and the region across the Jordan followed him. Now, and then chapter 5, verse 1, now when he saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. Okay, so we have here this picture of Jesus going from place to place, and in the beginning of chapter 5, he sits down on a mountainside, and his disciples come to him, and from there he launches into those teachings that we call the Sermon on the Mount. But the background is that you see Jesus teaching from place to place and doing all sorts of miracles. As one would think would happen nowadays if someone was doing the exact same thing. You think they become pretty famous pretty quickly. And what happens with famous people? They get crowds following them wherever they go. So it was in Jesus' day. Luke chapter 6, verse 12 through 19 introduces the Sermon on the Plain. And the reason we call it that is, well, let's just read it, and it makes it easier to explain. Luke chapter 6, beginning at verse 12. One of those days, Jesus went out into the hills to pray, and spent the night praying to God. When morning came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also designated apostles: Simon, whom he named Peter, his brother Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Simon, who was called the Zealot, Judas, son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. Now here's a little great side note. Right before Jesus makes a major decision in his life, a major event in his life occurs. He chooses 12 of his followers to be his apostles, his special messengers, including the one who would betray him, Judas Iscariot. Right before this major decision was made, or this major change was made in Jesus' life, what did he do? He spent the night praying to God. Now, I try and spend the night praying to God, I fall asleep. So how Jesus managed to stay awake, I don't know. But he spent the entire night praying to God right before this momentous occasion. How often do we seek God's help right before big decisions are made? How often do we seek the Lord's guidance right before a major change in our life? Well, we should follow Jesus' example here and definitely seek God's help and intervention and guidance on a deeper level than normal when such major things are approaching. So that's a little bit of a side point there. Verse 17, he went down with them and stood out on a level place. Went down and stood on a level place, hence the plain. A large crowd of his disciples was there, and a great number of people from all over Judea, from Jerusalem, and from the seacoast of Tyre and Sidon, who had come to hear him and to be healed of their diseases. Those troubled by evil spirits were cured, and the people all tried to touch him, because power was coming from him and healing them all. Looking at his disciples, he said, boom, he launches into his teachings. So, very similar setting here. Huge crowd. They've come to hear Jesus' teachings. They've come to be healed. There are people who are demon-possessed, and that's kind of a little bit of another sermon, another video for another day. But there was a whole lot of spiritual activity going on in Jesus' day, much more than was normal throughout biblical history, throughout mankind's history, at least in this region, especially when it comes to demon possession. It seemed to be almost on a plague level in Jesus' day as he was doing his ministry, as many people as sought his help for this. But you have a huge crowd, many of his disciples, his followers there, and so Jesus begins to teach them. Now, is it possible that this is just the Luke 6 is the abridged version of Matthew 5 through 7 with maybe some wording in there that Matthew didn't use, or some lines and teachings in Luke that Matthew didn't use, and vice versa? It is possible, but more than likely these are two different occasions. And so throughout history, mankind is called what's in Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount, what's in Luke, the Sermon on the Plain. Now, the important thing is these teachings are coming from somebody who is working miracles, who is showing every sign possible that he is from God. Now, the interesting thing about these sermons is that they both begin very similarly, and they both end very similarly. And it is that ending that I want to start with today. And there's a reason for that. I'll explain it after we look at the ending of both sermons. It's kind of like taking a novel, a book that you want to read, a good story, and so, I've heard of some people who do this. They'll grab a book, if it looks interesting, they'll read the very last paragraph. And if they like the very last paragraph, then they'll go ahead and buy the book and read it. So we're going to do that technique here. We're going to look at the last paragraph, so to speak, in each sermon and apply it as best we can. Matthew chapter 7, verse 24 through 29, Luke 6, verse 46 through 49, talk about a wise man versus a foolish man. And it's not like they're going one-to-one head in boxing or something like that, fighting each other. It's just more a wise man as opposed to a foolish man. I want to read Luke's version first, and then we'll hop over to Matthew. But again, you'll see they are very, very similar. Luke chapter 6, beginning at verse 46. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say? I will show you what he is like who comes to me and hears my words and puts them into practice. He is like a man building a house who dug deep and laid the foundation on rock. When a flood came, the torrent struck that house, but could not shake it because it was well built. But the one who hears my words and does not put them into practice is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. The moment the torrent struck that house, it collapsed and its destruction was complete. All right, without reviewing that, keep that in mind and let's read Matthew's version. Matthew 7, verse 24 through 29. If I can get there. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he had taught as one who had authority, and not as their teachers of the law. Now, as we saw, as I read here, the teachings are very, very similar. It's the same illustration, just with different wording. And in Luke, Jesus first starts out, though, with this question. Why do you call me Lord and do not do the things that I say? Just calling Jesus Lord, just saying I believe that Jesus is God's Son, in and of itself, it is, it's good, it's okay, but, well, it can be bad, depending on what you follow it up with. It does no good to say Jesus is God's Son. Oh, I believe God, I believe Jesus died for me. I believe he was crucified. I believe he rose from the dead. We can say it all day long, but if we don't take Jesus' ways, we don't take Jesus' teachings and put them into practice, we are the foolish man, building our house on sand. In other words, we are foolishly building our life on nothing. And when the storms of life hit, our lives are going to fall apart. It's going to come crashing down. But when we build our lives, when we build our house on the foundation of Jesus and his teachings, meaning we take them, we listen to them, we learn them, we put them into practice, then we are building our house on a strong foundation. And when life's trials, tribulations, when life's storms hit, our house will be able to stand. It doesn't mean that there's not going to be the times of storm, the times of tribulation, just because we follow Jesus. Probably on the contrary, probably there's going to be more storms and trials and troubles and tribulations when we follow Christ than when not. Regardless, we'll be able to endure it when our lives are built on the foundation of Jesus' teachings. Now, I say that because I have heard on the radio, and I can't even remember who's teaching this. They were going through the Sermon on the Mount, and they were basically saying that the standards that you see Jesus teaching in the Sermon on the Mount were never meant to be things for us to keep. What Jesus was teaching was just to show us how great, wonderful, and yet impossible to keep God's standards are. He's just trying to show us how desperately we need God's grace. It's not actually that he expects us to obey these things. Well, if you look at the final chapter, if you look at the end of the sermon, that's exactly not what Jesus' expectations are. His expectations, his desire, his instructions for us is that we be the wise person who takes his teachings and apply them to our life. We build our lives on the things that he instructs us to do and not do. So the wise man versus the foolish man, the illustrations used at the end of both Matthew and Luke completely destroy that theory and blow it out of the water. So when it comes to the Sermon on the Mount, here are the conclusion is build your life on Jesus' teachings. Take them and apply them. You're not going to be able to do it perfectly. That's what God's grace is for. But we learn to take his teachings and apply them to our life. And when it comes to studying these sermons, as we will in depth, we need to begin with the end in mind. Meaning, we need to remember that at the end of all this, Jesus is telling us, take these teachings and build your life on them. Build your house on them. So, some of the things as we go over the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain will be very challenging. There are some things you'll look at and you'll think, I've got that. I got that one licked. I've already got that in my life. I'm already doing that. Fantastic. I'm glad to see that I'm following Jesus' ways in this regard. There are other things that you might read and you think, oh my goodness, how in the world can I ever do that? Well, I want us to look here at the end at an example set for us by a man named Stephen. Stephen was a follower of Christ, and as far as we know, he was the first martyr for Jesus, meaning the first one killed directly for being a follower of Jesus. Because he followed Jesus, people murdered him. But first, let's look at something Jesus said as he himself was being crucified for us. Luke chapter 23, beginning at verse 32. Luke chapter 23, beginning at verse 32. Well, I'm here, and yet I can't find it. Two other men, both criminals, were also led out with him to be executed. When they came to the place called the Skull, there they crucified him, along with the criminals, one on his right, the other on his left. Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Here Jesus is being crucified, innocent, hadn't done anything wrong, sinless, having done nothing worthy of death, nothing worthy of a parking ticket, let alone being crucified. And he's up there saying, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. Now that prayer isn't just for the good people in the crowd that happen to be following him. That prayer wasn't for his apostles, wasn't for his disciples, wasn't for his mother, wasn't for anyone who was actually following him and was totally against him being crucified. No, that prayer was for the people that were having the nails nailed through his hands and feet. It was for the religious hypocrites that orchestrated the whole thing. It was for the soldiers that put the crown of thorns in his head and beat his back with the whip. It was for those people who had been shouting, "Crucify him!" He actually asked God, saying, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they are doing." And that is a true saying and worthy of acceptance, as the Bible tends to say. When we don't follow Jesus, we truly do not understand what we are doing and the depths of harm that it brings. That's just something we need to come to grips with. Now, the flip side of that is when we do follow Jesus, we don't comprehend either the amount of good that it brings. And that's, that's a good thing, because it's doing more good than we see or know or understand. But again, on the flip side, we really don't know what we're doing when we don't follow Jesus' ways. But now we look at this story and we think, oh, wow, that's a wonderful thing. That is so awesome that Jesus was able to do that. But man, Jesus was God's son. I mean, you can't expect a mere mortal human being to say something like that. Oh, can you? Or can you not? However that question should be phrased. That's where Stephen comes into play. Look at Acts chapter 7, verse 51 through 60. Stephen followed Jesus' teachings and put him in his life in multiple ways. One, he was definitely described as a man of great faith. And something else that he had in common with Jesus, if you read about the life of Jesus, one of the things you'll see is that Jesus lambasted the religious hypocrites of his day. That's what ended up getting him killed, is that he confronted the religious hypocrites who had political power and pulled the strings of society. He confronted them hard. He was rougher on them than anyone else. Now, he rebuked his disciples from time to time, for example, for their lack of faith. But when he really, really went to town, it was against the religious hypocrites. Well, Stephen, he had that same passion against hypocrisy. And in Acts chapter 7, he has been talking to some non-believing Jews that hated him. And he's gone through this long sermon. And now, the great thing about Acts chapter 7, by the way, it does give kind of a general overview of Old Testament history. So if you want a brief overview of Old Testament history, read Acts chapter 7. It's one page as compared to the many, many pages that are actually in the Old Testament, just as a side note. But he gets to the end of his little sermon here, and he says this: "You stiff-necked people with uncircumcised hearts and ears, you are just like your fathers. You always resist the Holy Spirit. Was there ever a prophet your fathers did not persecute? They even killed those who predicted the coming of the righteous one. And now you have betrayed and murdered him. You have received the law that was put into effect through angels, but have not obeyed it." Referencing the law of Moses, the laws that God gave the people of Israel through Moses. When they heard this, they were furious and gnashed their teeth at him. But Stephen, full of the Holy Spirit, looked up to heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. "Look," he said, "I see heaven open and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God." At this, they covered their ears, and Yelling at the top of their voices, they all rushed at him, dragged him out of the city, and began to stone him. Meanwhile, the witnesses laid their clothes at the feet of a young man named Saul, who would later become known as Paul, the follower of Christ. But Saul wasn't following Christ at this point. He was the one holding the coat so they could stone Stephen. Verse 59, while they were stoning him, Stephen prayed, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. Then he fell on his knees and cried out, Lord, do not hold this sin against them. When he had said this, he fell asleep. Another side note, the Bible often talks about death, at least in reference to followers of God, as just sleep, a form of sleep, falling asleep. They're very comparable, shall we say. But what did Stephen say? As he was being crucified, Lord, do not charge them with this sin. Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. Lord, do not charge them with this sin. It's not the exact same words, but it is the same principle. Now, how could Stephen, a mere man, not the Son of God, find the strength and inspiration to pray this prayer for the people that were killing him? It's because he knew Jesus. He had come to be so in love with Jesus, so enamored by Jesus, so desired so strongly to follow Jesus that in him, that he found the strength that Jesus found, that Jesus had to forgive the people, to ask God to have mercy on the people that were crucifying him. In the same way, Stephen found the strength to ask God to forgive people who are stoning him. In the same way, as you get to know Jesus, when you look at those teachings and you think, oh my goodness, how could I ever obey that? How could I ever come to follow that? As you get to know Jesus, God will help you find the strength. God will build within you the strength to take teachings of Christ that formerly you thought were impossible to keep. And all of a sudden, it's almost like a privilege to keep them. It's a joy to keep them. And it's a process. It takes time, but your spirit, your mind, your heart, it transforms and becomes more like Christ's heart as you get to know him. Okay, so enough for that. So I just wanted to try and lay a good foundation for studying the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain as needed or as it's appropriate. And again, be the wise man. Build your life on Jesus' teachings. Don't be the foolish man. It will tear your life apart to try and live your life against the teachings of Christ. May God bless you. May God bless this recording. Thank you for listening. Feel free to subscribe or recommend this to anyone who needs it. Thank you again. I'm humbled that you would listen to this. Have a great day. Bye-bye.